Hello, and welcome to another Healing Hearts program. My name is Leslie Holly, and I'm happy to be representing Von Green Funeral Services today to provide you another wonderful webinar series on grief, and particularly how grief affects spouses. Von Green is glad to have you here this evening to watch this recording. And Healing Hearts is a special program to help those in the community that are dealing with grief find additional support. Von Green is committed to supporting the communities that they serve. They have 4 locations, and they help with things such as funeral services, cremation services, services for veterans, and aftercare, to name a few. And now, let's begin the webinar for today. Today's program for Healing Hearts is called Mourning the Death of a Spouse and Looking Ahead. I'm your speaker today, Leslie Holly, and I'm happy to be here again. I'm a private practice owner in downtown Silver Spring, Maryland. I have expertise in building private practices. I'm a board member and past president for the Maryland Counseling Association. I'm also a presenter, and I specialize in trauma, life transitions, depression, and anxiety. Today, we'll be focusing on mourning the death of a spouse and looking ahead. We want to talk about grief, the specific signs and symptoms of grief when you are mourning a spouse, tools to help manage the loss, planning ahead, and lastly, when to seek additional help. What are the signs and symptoms of grief? How prevalent is grief? For older adults experiencing grief, their grief is going to be more intense at higher rates. Why is that? Because as we age, unfortunately, a part of life is losing loved ones, friends, and family. It becomes more constant. So when you're an older adult and you lose a spouse, you have higher rates of grief. And spousal loss, understandably, is common in older adults. About 2.5 million people die in the United States annually, each leaving an average of 5 grieving people behind. So not only when a spouse loses their partner, it affects the whole family and the whole family dynamic. There's something called the widowhood effect that affects older adults grieving a spouse's death. The widowhood effect basically indicates that when a spouse loses their loved one, they have an increased mortality rate compared to those whose spouses are still living, which is a really impactful statistic. A 2013 study in the Journal of Public Health showed that people had a 66% higher risk of dying within the first days of losing their spouse. So again, if you're someone who's struggling with losing your spouse, you have an increased mortality rate. That's why it's so important to make sure that you get the support that you need. Then, if we want to look at the coronavirus and how that has affected grief, of all the groups affected by the coronavirus, seniors have been hit the hardest. Roughly 8 out of every 10 deaths caused by COVID-19 has been from someone over the age of 65. We know COVID has been a hard thing for all of us, but in particular for the elderly. Many elderly are scared to even leave their homes for fear of getting coronavirus or what could happen to them. And think about that impact on losing a spouse as well during the coronavirus. So what are some things that we want to consider when we think of the widowhood effect? the physical and mental tolls of being a caregiver. So oftentimes for our seniors, when they're caring for a loved one who is about to pass, it's very stressful. It's very time consuming, not only physically, but mentally. And then there's also a physiological impact of grief. According to a 2022 study, the death of a spouse is a predictor of mental health decline that foreshadows worsening physical and mental health and elevated mortality. The millions widowed by COVID-19 can even also experience more worse health outcomes than pre-pandemic widows. And also, during this time when you're losing a loved one or a partner, you may have changes in your living environment. Maybe if you lived with your partner, now you don't want to live by yourself, or maybe your children or your support system doesn't want you to live by yourself. So now you're leaving your home and maybe going to assisted living or living with another family member. These changes are really hard on our seniors. And not only has the widowhood effect really pinpointed the physical and mental tolls, but also when we think about our health, our cardiovascular health can also decline. Our immune system dysfunction can also happen as well while we are experiencing grief for seniors who are losing a spouse. So it's really important to recognize that grief does not only affect our mental health, it affects our physical health, it affects our cardiovascular health, and it affects how we move through the next coming years. So it's very important to make sure that you're getting the help that you need. There was also another study that was done that says that the mortality risk was highest in the first 6 months following a spousal loss. And that high risk stays elevated for up to 2 years. So we know that spousal loss is associated with a higher risk of mortality, particularly in the first few years. So what are the signs and symptoms of grief? In this 2019 study, you'll notice that the first year is the hardest for grief, and we all pretty much know that. But grief doesn't end at month 19. If you look at this chart, what's most significant that I would like to point out is that losing a child or partner after 12 months, after a year and ongoing, the grief is constant. If someone loses a family member or close friend, the grief is high initially, but then after a year and ongoing, the symptoms kind of decrease some. They're easier to manage. And that's the same when losing a pet. The grief is extremely high the first year, but then as you can see after a year and ongoing, people start to feel a lot better. But for people that have lost a spouse, the grief is constant. So it's important to recognize when we talk about the grieving cycle and the grieving cycle ending, that the grieving cycle comes back and it often rears its ugly head around special occasions, anniversaries, holidays, and birthdays. So it's okay to recognize that and prepare for that as needed. And not only do partners that lose their spouse have difficulty with their physical and their mental health, they start to get a lot of negative thought loops. So here are some most common experiences that spouses have when they're grieving the loss of a loved one. 41% have intense sorrow, pain, and thoughts about loss. 27% have problems accepting the loss. And 18% feel guilt or self-blame for the loss. These negative thought loops can again affect our physical health as well. So let's look at how it affects our physical health. This was taken again from a 2019 study, and over 1,000 Americans were surveyed. So after a loss, 39% of people experience fatigue, 32% experience change of appetite. You may have headaches. 25% in the study showed that they indicated that they had headaches. 20% experience aches and pains. 15% experience stomach aches. 12% experience heart palpitations, which can really be linked to anxiety. 10% have an array of other symptoms as well. And 5% experience a new or worsening of a disease. So again, as we're talking about how to care for a loved one who's lost a spouse and what we need to be looking out for, not only mental health care, but also physical care, making sure that you're getting your regular checkups at the doctor, making sure that you're okay and healthy. So what are some tools that we can use to help manage the loss? It's really important, if you're grieving the loss of a loved one, to build community with others. For many of us who have a partner, our partner becomes our community after a while. But when you lose that partner, that significant other, it's a drastic change and isolation can set in. Make sure you build a community with others around you. Studies show that reducing or building a community can reduce physiological and psychological distress. What are some places where you can build a community? Churches, relying on your spirituality and your church community, friends and family members, maybe new groups that you can join, steppers organizations or travel cruises or a chess club. These are all kinds of things that you can join and build community. Research also shows that when we build community, and particularly when elderly build community, they feel more heard, they feel increased closeness within their community, and it also helps them deepen perspective on grief. For our seniors who are grieving, it's important for their feelings to be normalized. Oftentimes with seniors, they have younger family members supporting them, maybe children, maybe long lost family members that are younger, that may not understand specifically what they're going through. It's really important for seniors to connect with other seniors so they can have a deepening perspective on the grief and normalize what they're going through with other people that are going through similar things. Also, we know that a community provides a supportive place where you can feel accepted with the grief that you're experiencing. So again, the name of the game is to normalize our symptoms and to build connectedness so isolation doesn't set in. Here's some more tools to manage the grief. Seeking grief counseling. As I noted earlier, Vaughn Green Services presents these workshops, these Healing Hearts workshops that you can participate in and get information, especially on their website, blog information as well, and also seek grief counseling. Counseling can validate feelings and provide a safe, non-judgmental space for people. It's also a place where you can fully express your emotions in a non-biased environment. Don't be afraid to seek out grief counseling. The nice thing about grief counseling is it's specific to populations of people that are experiencing grief. And in a group grief counseling setting, you come as you are. You can say little or you can say a lot, but you can put yourself in an environment with other people who are experiencing loss, and that palpable loss creates connectedness and normalizes the feelings that you're experiencing. Another way that you can manage the loss is memorializing your loved one. After a loved one passes and the months go along, the pain still remains. A remembrance activity to memorialize your loved one is a way to celebrate their life, and it's also a way to help you find closure with them being in this life. It's also a way to bring loved ones together, and this transition from a physical life to a memorialized life allows the griever to develop a spiritual relationship with their loved one. This memorialized activity can be an annual activity, can be a every couple of years activity, can be when you just feel like it around the time, maybe the season the person passed away. Oftentimes, when we experience grief, as the months go by and we get closer to the time that the loss has occurred, we start to feel it first in our bodies. We hold grief and sorrow and pain and trauma in our bodies. So usually that's our first indicator that something's off. And sometimes as the years go by and the pain remains, we still get caught up in doing other things in our life. But say I lost a loved one in December. By October, November, I might start not feeling like myself. And I'm not really sure why until it hits me at the end of November or early December. Oh, that's right. This is the anniversary of my partner's death. When you memorialize a loved one, you can plan for that. When you start to get those indicators in your body first, physically, that something's off, you can say, I'm going to celebrate my loved one this year. I'm going to memorialize my loved one this December. I'm going to take the time to place this grief in this intentional moment and try to connect in that moment. Start a healthy routine. Studies show that people who pray to a loving and protective God are less depressed, more hopeful, experience fewer anxiety-related disorders, and feel more comforted and protected. So starting a healthy routine with prayer could mean starting some scripture in the morning or ending your day with scripture, or doing a Bible study plan, or picking up a book that has Bible study devotionals that you can do on a daily basis. These routines can help you get a new light on life, start your day off in a positive way, know and feel that you're protected by God, and know that you're not alone. Exercising. Incorporating an exercise routine also benefits your mental health. And I know I've said this many times. Studies show that regular exercise releases endorphins that enhance your sense of well-being. Exercise builds self-confidence. It can also increase social interaction and help manage depression and anxiety symptoms. Now, some of you may be watching this and thinking, oh, I can't run, Leslie. I can't lift weights. I have a bad hip. That's okay. You start slow and small. What's one small thing that you can do to increase your exercise? Some of us can start the day off stretching. Stretching does help and helps benefit our body and our physical and our mental health. We can do some yoga, some light yoga. We can maybe go for a walk around the block, or walk to the end of our driveway to get the mail and come back and sit on our porch and breathe in some fresh air. Little steps make a big impact, and consistency is key. And also meditation. So we know we talk about prayer. Meditation and prayer go hand in hand. Meditation reduces stress and can also improve conditions such as IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, PTSD, fibromyalgia. It can enhance human willpower to avoid unhealthy habits. It helps you really ground yourself and stay in the present. It can reduce the occurrence of depression symptoms as well. Meditation is a great practice in understanding how we can tap into those subconscious thoughts, how we can sit with them, how we can not let them control us, how we can quiet our mind and slow down our bodies and slow down our breath and listen to our bodies. Meditation, you can do 2 to 3 minutes a day of just sitting in silence, focusing on your breath, focusing on the temperature of the room, watching your thoughts kind of come and go like clouds. Some of the webinars in the past, we've done some meditation and visualization exercises, and we'll continue to do that. But meditation, the key is the repetition, so that when you are having a stressful day in traffic, or while you're volunteering, or when you get up in the morning and you just don't feel like yourself, you can go into yourself and tap into that subconscious mind. You can slow down your breath. You can visualize having a positive day. That, coupled with prayer, can get your day started off in a healthy way, in a positive way. So how do we plan ahead? So for many of us, we're talking about these symptoms and the signs and the things that you have to do to plan for the loss of a loved one. We're talking a lot about physical and mental signs and symptoms and things that we can do to alleviate those symptoms. But we don't talk about often in mental health care, what are the other responsibilities you have when you lose a loved one and when you lose a spouse? You're already dealing with a lot of the signs and symptoms that we just discussed today. And then you still have an array of financial responsibilities that you have to take care of. So planning ahead and pre-planning is really important. And if you're watching this today and you haven't started planning for the end of your life or your partner's life, I want you to start thinking about some of these financial responsibilities that are important. Contacting a lawyer if you can, gathering your financial documents, death certificates, having copies of those, social security card, marriage certificates, birth certificates, deeds, and titles to property, insurance policies, stock certificates, veteran papers, income tax forms, car title and registration papers, loan and installment payment books or notes. All of these things are going to be really helpful when planning for afterlife. It can become very overwhelming when you're experiencing grief. So maybe even talking to a supportive loved one now about, hey, can you help me or be my contact person to help me get these things in order? Because you're already going to be feeling significant grief. So planning ahead is key. Now remember, getting help, striving for balance. If you're out of balance, get help to find your balance again. Getting help isn't a bad thing. Many of us always feel like I could do it on my own. I could do it by myself. I don't need anyone. But again, your physical and your mental health will suffer for that. So don't be afraid to ask for help from others. Because if you're doing everything on your own, you're out of balance. And what we want to do is strive for balance as much as possible. Also, while giving ourselves grace. Notice the statistics we talked about today. That grief is consistent and it permeates. So every day is going to be different. Some days you're going to have more energy than other days, but you have to give yourself grace and balance. Don't push through things all of the time and force yourself to do things, because then your physical health will suffer. Build and maintain connections. Spend time with those you love and cherish. Start up that hobby again. Connect with your inner child. What were some things that you wanted to do when you were a young child that maybe you never have done before? Maybe you want to learn how to play an instrument, or maybe you want to learn a new language, or maybe you want to start spending more time with your grandchildren. Maintain and nurture healthy, long-lasting relationships. And I also want to note, if you're watching this webinar and maybe you haven't lost a spouse or not about to lose a spouse, but you have a friend or family member who has, make sure you build and maintain those connections with them as well. We know when we lose a loved one, and in particularly when a senior loses a loved one, that first month or two, everyone is contacting them and asking them how they feel, if they need anything. But as the months go by, nobody's contacting them anymore. And as the months and the years go by, that senior could feel more isolated. So make sure that you build and maintain connections with them. Reach out to them. I just had a senior tell me the other day that the anniversary of her partner's death, her brother called her the week prior and said, hey, why don't we go out and get something to eat? We haven't been out in a while. And the way they spent the anniversary of her partner's passing was going out to eat and spending some sibling time together. And it meant the world to her. So making sure that we don't forget our loved ones who have lost a spouse, because they need you more than ever, not just the first month and the second month when they experience the loss, but they need that continued support. So when should you seek additional help? So I get this question often. Again, grief is natural, grief is normal. We just talked today about the grieving cycle. It begins and it ends. It begins and it ends. It begins and it ends. However, what we really want to be looking for is the level of functioning. So in the DSM, which is a diagnostic manual that therapists and psychiatrists use, there is something called the prolonged grief disorder. And here's the criteria for prolonged grief disorder. This is indicators for 6 months or more, persistent and pervasive longing for a deceased loved one, persistent and pervasive preoccupation with the deceased of a loved one, maybe intense emotional pain. So we're talking about uncontrollable crying, anger where we're destroying things, blaming other people, driving a wedge between our other close relationships, feeling one has lost a part of oneself, and just that longing and that yearning to have that other person there. An inability to experience positive mood at all after 6 months or more. No positive mood, just emotional numbness, not being able to enjoy grandchildren or fun events or holidays with family, and difficulty in engaging with social or other activities. Again, 6 months or more. Naturally, when you lose your partner, you're going to feel all of these things. But over time, you want some of those symptoms to minimize and feel better. You want your functioning to increase. If you're low functioning or mid functioning, you want to, at that point, at least be mid to high functioning, meaning you can run your errands, do the things that you used to do, some of them on some days. You can take phone calls from loved ones and don't feel just emotionally numb, like you can't handle it. It's really important to think about your level of functioning and really check in with your symptoms. Again, the tools to help manage the symptoms of grief will also help you tap into, am I okay? Am I getting enough sleep? Is my heart constantly racing all of the time? Am I overeating or undereating? I don't have any appetite. Do I have a negative thought loop? When we do some of these activities to be with ourselves and sit with ourselves through prayer, through exercise, through meditation, we can mark our progress or lack thereof. It's really important. So again, when we look at the grieving cycle on our right, as you can see, it goes up and down and around, but prolonged grief, it just continues. It's persistent, it's pervasive, no happiness, inability to feel happiness. Again, you will still be grieving after 6 months and be sad and maybe having some times where you're crying. But if you have an inability to feel any happiness, that's a sign that you need more support. That isolation. If 6 months or more and it continues where you're isolating, you're not being around anyone, you're not seeing your children, your grandchildren, your community, you've stopped going to church, you've stopped doing all of the things that you enjoy and have completely isolated yourself, it's okay to recognize, I might need some additional supports. It's okay. And like I always say, you don't have to necessarily do therapy, but you have to get some help. Something has to change. It's imperative. So in conclusion, here are our references. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer any questions or concerns that you have about your lost loved one. Here you can also see our website information, our Instagram information, as well as Vaughn Green's contact information. After this webinar, I'm happy to take on any questions or comments via email, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much.